experience. You did some work with, you mentioned it anyway, AZ Alkmaar. So that was kind of after you obviously done rugby as well. So with Saracens and London Irish. So again, we'd be here all day if we spoke about everything, Bill. So I'm going to have to skip a little bit over that because I want to ask you about AZ Alkmaar.
Yeah.
Was that, by the way, did you work with Arne Slot there? Was he there when you were there, or?
Yeah, no, I was fortunate to during my 5 years at AZ. AZ was a baseball connection. I'd gone to Saracens. That was um, through I'd started to do some work. Phil Clark, the ex-Wigan and England Rugby League player, him and his brother had a sports data consultancy, the sports office based in Wigan, and they found out about my work. And I did some work with Phil and his brother, and then I worked with Phil at Sky on Sky Sport, and for 3 years provided all the statistical analysis to support their coverage of Super League, including developing a performance gauge. And Phil told his best mate from his Wigan days about me, Andy Farrell. Fast told Brendan Ventnor at Saracens. So I ended up going to Saracens and working there for 5 years with the coaches. So I came in, unlike football. The gatekeeper that brought me into Saracens, the two were senior coaches, the director of rugby and Andy Farrell, who was one of the coaches, and that's where I worked there purely on coach with the coaches, analysing to begin with Saracens' own performances. And then I moved into working on the opposition, and particularly starting to analyse the opposition that played in other leagues for European games. So I started to. So I worked there for 5 years, and I took that as far as I could, and then I got the opportunity. And I think 5 years kind of worked. After 5 years, I was saying the same thing. It was less effective, and by the time I left, they were on the cusp of becoming European champions. So. The first season I was there, they won the league for the very first time in their history, and by the time I left, they were regularly competing in the semi-finals and reaching the finals. And then the season after I left, they won the European tournament for the first time. I got the opportunity to move to AZ through Billy Beane. Robert Eenhoorn was a Dutchman who played ball at college, and had gone to college in the States and had been drafted by the New York Yankees. And Robert ended up playing around about 45 games, I think, in the major leagues. He calls himself a 4A player. He was too good for the triple A's, but not good enough to nail down a starting position. But he went back and ran for many years the national baseball operation, and they were incredibly successful at the European and world level. And so Robert became a very, very well-respected sports administrator. AZ Alkmaar are a relatively small club, small town, famous mostly for its cheese market, but a relatively small town. And they had a history of doing things their own way. Complete opposite of the Ridsdale Leeds. They had a small budget, they stayed on budget, and had a history of being innovative and doing things their own way to try and be competitive with the big three in Dutch football, Ajax, PSV, and Feyenoord. So Robert was brought in to manage. He was head of the whole of not only the sporting operation but the whole club. But he had a marketing and finance director that basically reported to him on the business side, so that Robert could concentrate on the management of the sporting side. First thing he did was use his baseball connections to reach out and contact Billy Beane, and he got Billy involved as an advisor to the board. And Billy had a group of people based in San Francisco that were crunching the numbers for player recruitment. One of Billy's first pieces of advice to Robert was get Bill involved. So Robert came over. I was in Australia at the time. Robert contacted me. When I got back from Australia, Robert came in. We spent 2 days holed up in a hotel in the centre of Leeds talking about how to run a football club, and how to run it properly. The role of data analytics, absolutely amazing. A couple of days where we just talked and talked and talked about, our experiences at the elite level and what to do. And it was immediately apparent that Robert and Billy were, they were chips off the same shoulder. The way they looked at things, very, very astute, had played the game, so they understood the game as a shirt, but they also were very business savvy, so they understood the game as suits, and were able to, and had respect in the dressing room as well as in the boardroom. Amazing characters. I've been very, very fortunate, along with Brendan Ventnor and others, to be mentored by people with that of that caliber. So Robert brought Billy in as an advisor and started on the recruitment. And one of my first roles was to sell the use of data analytics to the recruitment side. We looked. Robert's plan was, there's three elements to the football club in terms of the sporting operation. There's the academy, there's scouting, there's the first team operation. We looked at the academy. It was state of the art in terms of progressiveness and using data analytics. AZ had do things in youth development totally different from the Ajax model. Most of the British clubs copy the Ajax model. Get the kids in as young as possible, sign them at 8, take them out to playing with their mates on a Saturday and Sunday, and put them into an academy, and then at 16 select the very best for full-time scholarship. AZ's approach and their first team is totally dominated year on year by academy products. They leave the boys playing in local football until they're 11. And put all the resource into supporting the coaches. And they've got links with 162, in the order of 160, 170 local clubs. And they support the coaching. They'll bring the better kids in during the school holidays, but they don't pull them out of local football until they're 11. They feel that that's a better environment for them to grow up and develop their basic skills with good coaches, with their mates, rather than getting them pulled out of that. So we looked at that. AZ's academy was developing young players, and it was developing young coaches. It was developing young support staff. So people like yourself, starting as video analysts, were starting at the academy. So that box was immediate. One afternoon, absolutely blown away about how. So I remember being there an afternoon with Robert, and interestingly, the person that was working with Robert at the time to gain experience of management was Greta Steinsen, the Bolton and Icelandic international, who's now the technical director at Leeds, and has just assumed overall responsibilities for the 49ers international football operations. So I guess it's Greta that's going to be involved if the 49ers do acquire a majority stake in Glasgow Rangers, which will be an interesting development for a Celtic and Leeds fan, but that's another story. But so Greta and I, with Robert, had a day at the academy, blown away with how that box was ticked. The next up was the scouting, and I was told, ex-player, but very go-ahead, very open, and we had a great conversation. And it was him that made the comment about when he'd been surprised when I said that, but Billy goes and watches players, particularly the possible international recruits that Billy Beane goes in season. And that it was clear that's why he made the comment about Moneyballs and Albatross. It's a bit misleading in that respect. And I said, yeah, it's evidence based, and the evidence, the data is just not the numbers; it's the totality, and that. So that was ticked off. So the next was the first team. Well, that's a bigger hurdle to in any club to that. So what started was there was a performance analyst, a very good performance analyst who was very progressive. So he was analysing the video. And that. So what I started to do was to get the Opta data and starting to analyse the opposition, and to do a complementary report on each of AZ's games on the basis of the published data, the Opta data, that would complement what was being done in-house within the first team. But I was reporting to Robert and to the technical directors and the scouting staff, and then they were disseminated. But in the first instance, it was the executives in the football operation that were receiving my work. But they had a policy to gradually bring analytics into the day-to-day operation. The first major development in that was to appoint an assistant coach with the agreement of the head coach, who was analytically aware and progressive. And that was a certain character called Arne Slot. Mm. And then, so Arne became became my point of contact, particularly when he then became head coach. So analytics was brought into the first team and expanded in the first team through the appointment of a specific appointment of a coach that was that way orientated. Mm. And I found, so I was based in Leeds. I'd be going over on a regular basis to see games and so on. So when Arne, early doors, I had a meet. Arne had his own analyst working with him prior to coming to AZ, but that wasn't the way that AZ operated. They basically said, "Look, we're developing our operation, and we've got Bill's, we've got the video analyst, we've got Bill, and that." So I met with Arne. He'd been seeing my reports. And I said, what could I do? What type of analysis would be most useful for you? So we sat in his office for an hour or so, and he basically said to me, I don't think I'm giving anything away here, that what he needed to understand about opponents was basically how they used their possession. So what I started to develop was an analysis of passing networks. And I developed some graphics to accompany that. So I started to develop network analysis, applying it to passing and developing graphics and ways to extract key recommendations from the graphics about how teams played. And that then became a crucial part of the report that I was providing after the weekend game with regard to AZ and the opposition analysis. So particularly also with regard to the opposition analysis, I'd be studying and creating a passing network graphic for the opponents and trying to identify. And that's the way. That's how I operated up until I had 5 years at AZ, and I think we'd got to the stage, and with Arne Slot as head coach, that we got to the stage, and I agreed with Robert. I prompted the conversation. I thought we'd reached the stage by the summer of 2019 that we needed. It was appropriate for a full-time local analyst to be working with Arne rather than me working from a distance on a part-time basis. I thought they needed someone who, was fluent in Dutch, who was going to be there day in, day out, and could work in combination with Arne Slot as head coach and with the video performance analyst. Mm-hmm. And Robert and I agreed that in the summer of 2019. So I stepped back at that time. I was going to have a break because I've been sort of full on from 2010 to 2019, kind of full on with a career as an analyst, data analyst in sport, as well as with being an academic professor. So I stepped back, and then the pandemic hit the following year. And in a sense, that step back has become a step back for about 5 or 6 years.